Welcome to the lABLEd podcast, a show about disability, illness and difference. I'm Lucy.
And I'm Alice. And that's Lola.
Kaleidoscope identity, and this is who I'm meant to be. I'm just labelled me. I'm just labelled me.
Hi guys! Don't forget, in this episode, I might swear, Lucy might cry, and you can check out details of the trigger warnings on our website.
Thanks for joining us today, Jessica, for this episode of lABLEd the podcast. It's very nice of you to join us.
No problem whatsoever. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. I wondered if you could perhaps start off the episode just by talking about your disability and or health condition, please.
Yeah, sure. So I have something called Marfan Syndrome, which I was diagnosed when I was very little. I believe I was 3 years old. Marfan Syndrome is a disorder of the connective tissue, so it affects quite a lot of different parts of your body, kind of the structure of how your body works and internal organs and things like that. So the main sort of things that it affects are your eyes and your heart and vascular system, bones, muscles. It's pretty much everything that can be affected.
It sounds like everything.
That's a whole collection you've got ongoing there.
Sounds like it'd be easier to say what it doesn't affect.
Yes. Yeah, so with me, what I've noticed the most with it is obviously being very tall. I'm 6'1",
Wow.
and I have very large feet, so they are size 10 shoes that I wear, which is the same as my partner, which is a bit embarrassing, but you know, we'll get past that. And then it's also particularly long kind of limbs, like my fingers are very long. I have a really large arm span. So one of the ways that they can diagnose Marfan syndrome is obviously going to a genetic appointment, and they will basically get you to stand there and hold your arms out, stretched out to the sides really wide, and they'll measure. And if your tips of your middle fingers from one tip to the other is taller than your height, then you're pretty certain that you've got something like Marfan syndrome.
Oh, okay, so it's sort of stretched from one hand to the other. Your arm span's actually taller than,
Yes.
longer than you are tall.
Yes. Yeah, it's a bit awkward when you're in the appointment and they're getting you to stand there and you're thinking that you look a bit like, I don't know, Jesus on the cross or something. But
Yeah, I can imagine.
Do you remember it if you were only 3? Do you remember that diagnosis, that sort of going through that process?
That wasn't actually when I was 3. We went for genetic testing in my teenage years. I can't remember exactly when it was. My mum took me just to get it absolutely confirmed, because my GP at the time had always said, this is, you know, what she's got, and she's, you know, best to get checked at the Glenfield Heart Hospital and to have yearly scans. And they knew everything was in line, but I'd never had a real formal test, and this is exactly what she's got and how she got it. So we decided to do that quite late, actually. I'm not sure why it was so late. I'll have to ask my mum. But yeah, we went along to this appointment, and they looked at the length of my fingers, my arms, as I've already said. There's also a hypermobility thing. So muscles and fingers, you can like do all sorts of weird and wonderful things with your hands and bend your thumb in a strange way. And there's all sorts of things that are very known in the Marfan community. And also easily kind of dislocating joints and things like that. So
do you experience any sort of pain with those dislocations, or the fact that you are so bended? Do you think to yourself, that really hurts this morning, and then realise sort of something's popped out of a socket somewhere? Or
I did when I was younger, definitely. I remember a particular incident where I can't remember how old I was. I must have been about maybe 7 or 8, and I leant over my bed to like pull the duvet over and make it and tuck it in really nice and just, you know, make it look good. And I remember, because I kind of sprawled over the mattress, like with my knee. I remember my knee popping, and I couldn't move. So I literally was stuck, like crouched on this mattress, like didn't know what to do, screamed. My brother came in and was like, "Oh, it's fine, Jess, they'll just have to sort your leg off, don't worry." And he was making it worse, so I was crying my eyes out. Eventually it somehow just clicked back into place. Things like that would happen quite a lot when I was younger. I don't know if it's because of how fast my bones were growing or what, but not so much nowadays. I mean, I do have kind of weaker muscles and ankles and things, so I'm quite clumsy. I'll quite often stumble and trip. My ankle will roll on itself quite a lot. Not necessarily pain as much.
So it's not like a constant ache. It's just a kind of crazy.
For me personally, no. I know Marfan Syndrome affects people in completely different ways, and there are people that have it a lot worse than I do, because I'm parts of like groups and forums and stuff online. So for me, I don't really have daily pains and struggles. The only thing I do get quite regularly is back pain, because I have a mild scoliosis that is also associated with Marfan Syndrome. So that was a lot worse again in my kind of child and teenage years. I remember high school probably was the hardest time, because I don't know if it was the same where you guys went to school, but in like science class, most students were told to sit on those wooden stools. So like that's just the typical, that's what you sit on. And I remember just it causing agonizing pain, having nothing to support my back. So because I need quite supportive chairs and lumbar support and things like that. I remember my mum actually having a conversation with all my teachers saying Jessica needs a special chair. And that's basically how she phrased it. So every time I'd have a science lab lesson or anything, they would wheel me in a computer chair that I would then sit on. And all the other kids would be like, "Oh, why do you get the comfy chair? Oh, my back hurts, miss, too. Why does Jess get the chair?" And like a lot of it was just friendly banter, but a lot of bullying as well.
I have got cerebral palsy and I'm in a manual wheelchair, and it was only when I was about 16, 17 that it was tail end of paediatrician years, and he came regularly to school to do regular checkups. And I changed my pediatrician. Well, my original pediatrician had retired, and we had a new one come in. And he sat me on the edge of this bed in the nurse's office at school and said, I was out of my wheelchair, and he said, "Oh, do you know you've got scoliosis?" No, it's the first I've heard of it. But then once I knew that was there, I realised that that's why I can't lie on my back in bed. I can't lying on the actual lump where the scoliosis is only very slight. So if you see me sat up, you wouldn't notice it. But it's only when I've got my shirts off and stuff, you kind of notice the slight lump. But it was only then when you realise actually that's why it hurts, isn't it? Because there's a lump there that shouldn't be there. And it's amazing, really, that it took them so long to realise that I've got a sort of lump on my back. But I was like, when they told me, I was a bit like, "Is there anything else? Would you like me to add to the list?"
I think that could be it's interesting because it can be quite sort of almost cathartic sometimes to get that diagnosis and have that label to put on it to go, "Oh, it's because of that, is it?"
Yeah.
And I think that's something, because I was always like, my mum's always sort of assumed that I've probably got some level of dyslexia, because I have the classic signs of I get the right letters but in the wrong order and sort of those sorts of things. But we never bothered to get me tested or anything at school, because we sort of figured, well, I'm getting all the support I'm probably going to get anyway because of my eyesight. It's not what else are they going to do? Give me even bigger print or whatever. But I have often thought, maybe getting that diagnosis for me might make me feel a little bit, just almost reassuring to say, oh well, actually there is a reason behind this. And so I don't ever identify myself as dyslexic because I've not had that diagnosis, but it is something that's always sort of been interesting to me.
I don't know whether it's the same for you, Jess, but sometimes I wake up in the morning and I have a new pain, and I'm like, is this just a visitor, or is this a new thing that I've now got to deal with for the, get on top of? And if sometimes you think, okay, it's just a visitor because it's easing a bit. As soon as I move, it's gone. And then other times you're like, no, this is causing me a bit more of a headache. What else is there now? Really? Do you want to just pack it in? Is that the same sort of thing for you? Have you discovered like new things that you think, oh God, not this again? Like,
yeah, I mean, with Marfan's obviously affecting so many parts of the body, there is always something new that pops up. And after some surgeries that I'd had, there was quite a lot of fluid retention, and that's a whole new thing that I'd never experienced before. So I had quite swollen legs for a while, which was very painful, and that comes and goes. So sometimes it's fine, and then other times I have to wear one of those compression stockings.
like a flight sock.
Yes, yeah. Which are not fun, but they do the job, so you have to kind of grin and bear it. Yeah, and just, I mean, I find when I've been on my feet for a long time, walking around, before all of COVID and stuff, and going to town and shopping, I'd get pains in only one of my shoulders, and I never really understood why. It wasn't kind of how I had my handbag or anything silly like that. There would just be one part of my back that would ache more than the other parts. I've never actually got that diagnosed or mentioned it because it happens so irregularly, but that is always the part of me that is like quite a throbbing pain if I've been, on my feet for a long amount of time.
It is weird, isn't it? Because sometimes you do think, now when is the time to mention this to a professional? Because is it going to make it sound like I'm making this up if I go to them and go, actually, it's not so bad today? And I think when I was referred for neurophysio a few years ago, I was having a lot of back, just general aches, and I was trying to get on top of it. So they sent me for some physio to sort of stretch my limbs and everything. And when I got there, and they said, right, well, what's the problem? And I was like, well, my back hurts a bit sometimes, and my hands hurt a bit occasionally and you do think to yourself, if I'm not careful, they're going to think, she like, is this kind of like in her head? Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like making that decision of when do I say something, and when I mean, with the whole physio thing for me, it was when I was crying with my GP, and he was like, what is the matter? And I was like, everything hurts. And he was like, okay, we need to go get this sorted out. But even then, because once you get the crying out of your system because it's frustration, you kind of like, okay, I'll go and see somebody, and then you're like, is it really bad today? Is it? So you kind of have to over egg the pudding a little bit, don't you, on that first appointment?
My condition is one of those things that it deteriorates, but in kind of terms of pain and stuff like that, it's off or it's on.
Yes.
Do you find sometimes like you're managing your pain in terms of not, taking medication to manage your pain, but managing your pain in the way that you're displaying it externally, so that, for the benefit of other people? Do you sometimes play it down? Do you sometimes feel like you've got to play it up for professionals and family members and stuff like that?
I certainly play it down to people around me because I don't want to come across as that miserable disabled person who's always complaining of pain. Because at the end of the day, you can say you're in pain once or twice, and then after a while it's like a broken record, and people go, yeah, all right, we know. Yeah, all right, we know. So I definitely do play it down to people, not necessarily my family, but wider friends, acquaintances. If I go to work, I don't necessarily open with the morning line in our morning meeting about everything's hurting me today. It has to be really bad for me to go, it's hurting. So I know I certainly play it down. I don't know about you, Jess. What happens with you?
I think it's really interesting because I think if anything, the people you should be talking to about how you're feeling that day and the levels of pain or anything is probably your friends, not necessarily, you know, those acquaintances that you see maybe once a month or a year or something, or just know online or whatever. But with me, I always found that I didn't really talk about it very often because I almost didn't want to acknowledge I was different. So, I mean, I wasn't ashamed. I've always been quite sort of, I don't know, like a optimistic, glass half full kind of person rather than half empty. So you get dealt the cards you're given and you just go with it. But when it came to my kind of core, kind of close group of friends, I almost felt like if I talked about it all the time, it would be a bit dull or boring, and it's kind of the same thing again, and it's, oh, Jess is talking about her heart again, or this, or but obviously I know that my friends love me and would always listen, but it also didn't really come up in conversation that often.
No.
Do you think that your friends and your peers avoided talking about it because you were avoiding talking about it, or do you think it was something that they didn't they knew you as more than that, and so it was just something that didn't cross their mind?
A bit of all of that, I think. I mean, with me not talking about it, obviously no one's gonna necessarily bring it up if they maybe don't understand everything about the condition or how I'm feeling. If someone doesn't know how you're feeling, then it's very difficult to just sort of go, oh, and tell me about your back pain today or something. You're not just going to drop that in. But I also feel that I have quite a kind of strong sort of approach to everything. So I don't necessarily feel like I act like I'm sort of less able or any of that. So I think my friends can genuinely forget as well, because it's not something that's completely obvious. I mean, yes, I'm tall, yes, I have long skinny fingers and all of this, but I'm just Jess as well at the end of the day. And I think they just sort of don't want to bring it up because it doesn't make me who I am, even though it is a huge part of me, I suppose.
Do you wish that people did bring it up more? Do you wish that it was talked about more openly?
I don't know, really. I mean, I do talk about things quite often with my partner, and he has quite a good understanding of it all, because we've been together 12 years, so he kind of knows a lot of the ins and outs. With my friends, I mean, I've had friends that I'm still very close to for like half of my life now, like a good 16, 17 years. I've known certain best friends, and they've seen me through all sorts of scary health issues and hospital stays and all sorts. So yeah, I mean, for them to have a bit more of a knowledge of Marfan syndrome, I suppose, would be interesting, but I don't know, really. It's hard to think about that.
You say in your pre-record form that we send out to all our guests before we actually sit down and have an interview that you don't necessarily call yourself disabled. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say the way Marfan syndrome affects me and has affected my life. It didn't feel like a disability, although I was less abled. I feel like, I mean, it's not something that would qualify for, what's the word, PIP. But yeah, no, so I don't qualify for that. Although there was a time when I think we looked into it and we tried, but like I said, Marfan syndrome affects people in so many different
ways.
levels.
Yeah.
There are people with Marfan syndrome that do get PIP, and rightly so, because they can't stand up for however long or work a job or anything, and I'm quite lucky in that respect. So, and I'm quite active, so I feel like disability, that doesn't quite fit me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that sort of ties in. It's interesting to hear you sort of talk about it because, you've you're sort of saying perhaps that people that you know and who sort of love and care about you are not necessarily as aware as you might like them to be of your health condition. Do you think that is partly in response to the fact that you don't identify as disabled, and so you almost don't feel as though your experience of that health condition is such that, you know, you should be, if you're not identifying as disabled, you sort of essentially, there's not really a grey area, so you're identifying as not disabled. So do you think that accounts for part of the reason why, you know, some of your friends and loved ones don't necessarily always consider the difficulties that you have?
Potentially. I mean, my mum in particular would say that I don't have a disability, even though she probably knows more than anyone kind of the struggles and what I've been through and how it's affected my life and impacted everything I do. I don't know. I just think like the whole sort of pigeonhole and categories and, you know, terms of disability and things. I suppose for me, I always think there's somebody worse off. So for me to call myself completely disabled, and whereas I don't obviously qualify for PIP and I don't have a blue badge or anything, I can't park in the disabled car parking spaces and things like that. So I don't know. I definitely am. It's really hard to explain. I am definitely less abled, and there are things that I cannot do that other people do, and it affects all sorts of things like sports and hobbies and just even kind of walking. Like I'm quite slow at walking up hills and things. Like my friends can all be off miles ahead and I'm kind of like bringing up the rear and things like that. But I think I have limitations, and that's probably the extent of it. I don't know.
I am disabled, so I'm in a wheelchair, but you can see that I'm disabled. I can't walk at all, can't stand on my feet without falling on the floor. If I was to let go of the thing I was holding on to, I'd end up on the floor. However, even though I am quite clearly disabled, I often use the term I have barriers just like everybody else. I think that is a good way of covering it, especially if I'm bringing it up in the first instance, like, because a lot of people hear the D word and they go like, oh no, I don't know what to do. So I will often say, I'm just like you, I'm sat down and I have the odd barrier. You know, it doesn't stop me from doing anything. And I'm a passionate believer in that. And yes, I have barriers, and some of those barriers to non-disabled people may look like huge ones, but to me, because I've never known any different, they're just like, I just do them every day without even thinking about them. Do you know what I mean? It's like if an able-bodied person was to shadow me all day, they'd think, oh my God, the effort. Do you know what I mean? Whereas to me, it's like I've got to get in the shower, and yes, it takes me 20 minutes longer than everybody else. I mean, you know, I can get in the shower and out of the shower again. And I have things to help me do that. But so I can do it. I've just got extra barriers to consider when I do everything. So it slows me down. That's what I always say in the first instance.
I think what's interesting about this conversation is that it's sort of highlighting that there are these different perceptions of words like disability amongst sort of for different people. So, you know, Jess, your association with disability is obviously strongly linked to a very kind of medical model of it, of you have to have certain qualifiers. You know, if you're disabled, you can't do X, Y, or Z, and you are entitled to A, B, and C. Whereas I think, you know, Lucy's approach to it is more of it's part of her combined identity and
the social model of disability, the fact that it's the world around me that's disabling, that not the fact that I am disabled.
I think, I mean, my personal approach is somewhere in between medical and social, I think. But I think, you know, it's interesting that, you know, Jess, you've said that Marfan's affects people in a lot of different ways. Well, cerebral palsy affects people in a huge variety of ways. There are people with CP who can, mobilize independently on their own feet and things like that, but also have problems with pain and all sorts of things. So it is, a lot of disabilities are about that kind of spectrum. And I suppose it's just very interesting to sort of interrogate that difference between how you each interpret that word, because ultimately, that's the whole point of what we're sort of trying to explore here, is what these labels mean. And I think that it's interesting for somebody like Lucy, who has a very visible disability, to be more accepting and welcoming of the disabled label than somebody like you, Jess, who perhaps has to work harder to say, actually, I can't do this. Actually, I need help. Whereas when people see Lucy, they're probably more likely to offer help because her disability is just that much more visual.
Yeah.
Would you class your sort of impairment as an invisible disability, Jess?
Yes and no. I mean, there are obviously huge parts of it that are invisible. There are parts of it that are very visible, with the kind of the way my body looks and things. Yeah, like I suppose the biggest part is if you were to look at me like what Alice was saying, you wouldn't necessarily think there was anything wrong. Is wrong the right word? Wrong is probably not the right word, but there isn't anything unusual or different. Yeah. So I haven't really thought about it in terms of what someone would think looking at me, because I'm quite, I don't really care. Like I'm quite sort of, not a lot tends to get me down. And if someone wants to think that I'm tall and lanky and four eyes and all these horrible words that I've heard, that's fine, and I can just kind of brush that off. And I don't know if that's part of my upbringing or
I was going to say, is that growing up and looking, being quite tall and being quite visibly different, and obviously I don't know, did you have to cope with people staring, and if you did, how did you work on some sort of coping mechanism with that? Is there or do you just develop this really thick skin and think, yes, I know they're staring at me, but I'll give them something to stare at, kind of, do you open rather than sort of go, oh, they're staring at me, what on earth are we going to do,
Yeah, I mean, I try to say that I own it, but I mean, in literally from primary school upwards, I was always the tallest in class. So if you'd have like a class photo, I was always the one bang in the middle, right at the back.
Yeah,
like I was like the tallest point, always.
Draw your eye in.
Yeah, and it was usually just boys near me, and then all the girls were like down the front somewhere. Yeah, so I was always the tallest. I was always kind of picked first for like basketball games and netball and that sort of stuff, where they kind of think, she can reach the hoop without even jumping. When I was allowed to play, that was. But yeah, I mean, people, particularly like things, the height and the hands and the glasses, I'd say, are the fingers more than hands, but the things I get noticed about the most would be my height and my eyes and my glasses. So I would notice people kind of staring, and I just kind of, I don't know if it's the confidence that my mum put in me growing up, or my grandparents, because I always remember my granny saying to me when I was younger, oh, you're tall and slim, you're beautiful, you'll be a model one day, like you're perfect, and all of these like lovely things, which I was always like, no, don't be silly. And then I think it was about like kind of high school time, like definitely year 7 onwards, it was more, it wasn't that people were noticing me that affected me, it was that like there was definitely bullying. I was bullied quite badly in school, luckily never kind of violently or anything like physical, like abusive or anything like that. It was just name calling and words, and I've already mentioned a couple of them, like lanky and four eyes and that kind of those horrible.
That could be the stuff that sticks with you the longest, though. The kind of the mental and emotional bullying, psychological is the word I'm looking for. Psychological bullying.
Yeah, definitely. And those were more the things that I felt like I needed to build some sort of coping mechanism for, as you say. So I don't know. My mum, actually, I know I've mentioned my mum a lot, but I mentioned to her quite recently that I was bullied quite badly in school. And she was very surprised because I was always, she said to me, I was always very happy and cheerful and friendly, and I didn't show it. So
did you make it a conscious decision, like, not to tell parents that you were being picked on or bullied, or
do you think you just left it at school? Do you think it was something that you were able to compartmentalize and go, well, this is a school thing, and actually at home I'm welcomed and cared for?
Yeah,
I think definitely, like, I just tried to forget about it. I didn't mention it. It wasn't on such a bad scale that I ever had horrible thoughts about anything. But no, I mean, I don't know if I was just very thick-skinned, or I just had a really good group of friends around that would take my mind off it. And then I think the more I didn't react to any kind of name calling or bullying, they did start to back off, and they'd find a new target and things like that. But then I also realised that I developed quite a good sense of humour. I feel like I was always the funny one in the group. Like, I'm quite sort of out there and a bit silly, and I was also a bit larger when I was younger, so I was the kind of funny fat friend. That's kind of
You do hear a lot as well with a lot of comedians and things like that. I've been doing some work on a comedian for a show that we're doing later, that a lot of comedians say, well, I was bullied, and so I started making them laugh so that they'd laugh instead of hurt me.
And I do think that disabled people in general, well, I know this is a general sweeping statement, but a lot of people that I know who are disabled, they're extremely resilient, and they do develop this sort of personality. I mean, my best friend will say, I know when you're nervous because it's like joke every 5 minutes. And as soon as you calm down, it sort of goes away, because it's almost like I can't let them see that I'm not a fun person to be around. I need to joke all the time. And then as soon as I calm down and I realise that they're all right, everybody's all right with the fact that Lucy's on 4 wheels, I calm down and they start to see me for me. And my friend's like, stop with the jokes.
I am exactly like that. Me and my husband have definitely had arguments, like after we've left parties, where he's gone, I know that was hard for you when you were really anxious, but you cannot make jokes at my expense like that. Because that's what I do. It's not jokes at my expense. It's always jokes at other people's expense, and I'm an absolute shit for it. And I know that I'm doing it, and I need to not do it. But it's my defense mechanism in a lot of ways to help me manage that anxiety.
I always think it's because, like, if I get the joke in first, then they can't hurt me. I definitely think that is a thing. Like, if I make a joke first, they know that A, I'm all right with it, and B, they can't do it because I've already said it. Do you know what I mean? I'm very self-deprecating a lot of the time, and I don't even realise I'm doing it these days. And my friends will go, will you just stop it? And I'm like, what? And it's only when somebody points it out, I go, oh yeah, actually that was a bit, like, I was really hard on myself there. But I think that's over the years, especially when I went to a mainstream setting for my education. So I went to college and it was a mainstream setting. I thought, if I do the funny stuff, then I've protected myself. That's like that, putting that heavy coat round me and nothing can hurt because I've already said it. So I do think that disabled people and people with health conditions or have experienced difference growing up, they do develop this thick skin where you go, all right, I'll make the joke first. It's all right, yeah.
Yeah, I'd say I'm very, very similar in that respect. And even something as small as, I mean, if I talk in a group of people, like in people that I know really well, I can still go really red in the face, and I don't know why I do it. It could be people that I've known for years, it could be people that I see every day, like work colleagues. I'm not a particularly shy person, but when there's a lot of focus on myself, I go really red. So, and there's times when I can feel it coming, I can feel like the warmth, and I know it's not necessarily anything to do with my condition or anything, but that's a perfect example of me going, okay, I'm going to go bright red now. Everyone just ignore it because I can't help it. I'm not like particularly embarrassed. There's just something about my cheeks go really warm, and they've just always done it, and then it goes away. So I just sort of go, just ignore the redness. I'm just being stupid.
It's not me. It's not me. It's like a second. I to help with my anxiety, I always call my that I know is caused by my cerebral palsy that I get, because I get this thing that if I go into a room full of people, that I always think that they're going to think, oh bless, look, they bought for the day out, and I just think they're going to just, and I know it's in my head. I know that all the time it's me that's done that, not them. They're probably not thinking, oh bless, but it's me. I'm thinking they're going to be thinking, oh look, they brought her out for the day. So I work myself up into a tiz, feel horrendous the whole like week before, on the day of the actual, like if I'm going to a meeting, I feel horrendous. And then I get this voice in my head saying, well, you're useless anyway. They're just going to think you're ridiculous. So I'm talking myself into it. So I call that voice in my head Cyril, my cerebral palsy.
I like it.
And once I've identified that that's Cyril kicking off, it sort of like takes a bit of away a bit of the nastiness, because I know it's not me. That's not my voice. That's not me thinking that. That's a byproduct of my condition that's causing me to hate myself, because I know I'm quite good at what I do. I know I'm a good communicator, but my brain will tell me that everybody hates me and I'm terrible at what I do and I should just stay at home and not bother. And I know that that's my cerebral palsy.
The thing that I always think when I find myself in situations like that, and I do the same, I get very in my own head about stuff, is that you just have to remember, like, you can never underestimate everybody else's ability to not give a shit about you and be only thinking about themselves as well.
Yeah,
so when you're standing in that room going, oh fuck, they're all looking at me, they're all thinking, they're standing there going, oh shit, I hope nobody's noticed that I've got my pants on backwards, you know,
or the flies are undone or something.
Exactly. Everybody else is, oh, I should have brushed my hair again, or I didn't. Like, nobody's looking at you and going, oh, what's her deal, because they're all as anxious and fucking self-obsessed as we are. It's just that we've got an extra thing to be anxious and self-obsessed about.
Yeah. It's weird, isn't it? And then when I calm down and everything's all right, I think, well, that was bloody stupid. What I was being such an idiot that I allowed myself, and because I know it happens every time. And you know, people, you know, I'll text people in the morning and I go, I know exactly what this is. This is you working yourself up, and it's you listening to that inside voice. Sometimes I say, like, the cerebral palsy voice is, on most days, he's quiet and sits in a corner and he's quite quiet and polite. And other days, he's like right up in my face, screaming at me, saying, you're useless, you are. And the more I let myself listen to that constant tape of, you're terrible, you're a terrible person, you're terrible, and also you can't walk, so you're useless, everybody's going to think you're an idiot. The more I listen to that, then of course you're going to believe it. Do you know what I mean? So you just have to kind of like not let yourself think, oh my God, I am really terrible. I mean, there are days where I have been a complete bitch. I'm not going to lie. There are days where I am a cow, and I know I'm a cow, and I will apologize. So I'm not going to say I'm whiter than white and I'm perfect. I'm very irritating, but I know I am not those things that I let my brain would let me believe.
And I think it's interesting as well, because it kind of comes back to what we were talking about, the different ways that people interpret words like disabilities, because it's that can't It's the people who are associating disability and difference in health conditions with a can't. You can't walk, so you're bad. You can't see, so you're bad, or whatever it is. You know, you can't do something, and so if it's not, they might not be you can't, so you're bad. It might be you can't, so I feel sorry for you, so I'm sad for you. And I think that that's what's really interesting, I think, about disability activism at the minute, is that there are a lot of people really trying to re-embrace words like disabled, to kind of go, well, actually, disability isn't about me not being able to do something. It's about barriers that have been put in place in front of me, and my disability is just the thing that has, you know, as you said, Lucy, it's the world that disables you.
I think as well, the other reason why they're so scared of disability is the fact that disability can happen to anybody at any time. And so that in itself is quite a scary prospect to think about. And I think maybe that, coupled with the fact that I wouldn't want anybody feeling sorry for me, you know, I wouldn't want to have those struggles that Lucy or Alice or Jessica faces. I think it's a bit of fear as well that it could possibly happen. A lot of people are so not socially aware, I think, and that misunderstanding and misinterpretation of what disabled people say, especially with the online activism. So we will raise an issue specifically on Twitter or something, or we'll have a conversation, and you will always get one individual who just doesn't understand and will twist what we say. Like they'll say, "Oh, well, calm down. Oh, well, calm down." And you think, this is like the tip of the iceberg. This is the one thing that I am most calm about. This is the tip of the iceberg. And I think that so there is that element of fear. It's fear, misunderstanding, and just not misinterpretation. I think that's what it is the seed of it. And then there's lots of different offshoots. That it's a big thing and I don't understand why it is so scary. I don't understand why people don't embrace difference, as in a disability difference. It just baffles
I think people
me.
don't embrace difference across the board. You ask people who have, you know, gender differences and ethnic differences and things like that. Yeah. Across the board, people are afraid to ask those questions. I mean, there's an element of that people feel a need to ask questions and to understand difference. And I can grasp that in some respects when it's about making sure that you're able to accommodate a person's needs. Yeah. But in a lot of ways, actually, difference has bollock all to do with your daily interactions with a person.
Exactly.
I think as well, people don't necessarily know the right thing to say, and to not look stupid, they just won't say anything.
Yeah. Which then leads to being sort of the silence and not saying anything just leads to more confusion because they don't want to ask the question. I always say that there is no stupid question because I've heard them all. So I spend, you know, when I'm on Twitter, I am very open and I'm very honest about the struggles I have, because I think if I can be that one person that somebody sees on social media that is being quite honest and open and saying, ask me a question, it won't offend me because I've heard all of the questions. And if I don't want to answer a certain question, I won't answer it. You know, I just pick through the ones I want to answer. It doesn't mean to say that I am completely available to everybody all of the time, but I think it helps me really, because I feel like I am helping the bigger picture by being that open and honest person and not being defensive when I know that people ask a question and it may not come out quite right. They may not have worded it quite right. I know that there is no malice behind that question. They are just curious and they would rather know, but they don't quite know the language to use. So I will then answer their question and say, but maybe don't broach. If it was somebody else, don't broach the subject by saying, like, what's wrong with you then?
You told an interesting story about when you wrote to, what's her name? Dame
Tanny Gray-Thompson.
Yeah. You know, might be worth retelling that story because I think that's an interesting one.
Yeah, so when I was about 13 or 14, I wrote a questionnaire and sent it off to Tanny Gray Thompson for the school newspaper. I think it was a school newspaper.
Because I think you said at the time she was basically the only other disabled person that you knew in the world.
It was that and Stephen Hawking, and I didn't stand a cat in hell's tent with Stephen Hawking. And she was growing up. She was the poster girl of people with disabilities. So I wrote to her and I basically said, "Could you please fill this questionnaire out for our school paper?" Not thinking that I would ever get a reply, and she did. She wrote back. She sent it back, and I'd written a question. And I can't exactly remember the wording of it now, but I'd used the term wheelchair bound because I didn't know any different. I'd always, we'd used wheelchair bound, and I'd never taken offence at it because I just heard somebody say it and gone, "Oh yeah, well that's what must be what they call us." So I wrote wheelchair bound, and she crossed it out and put wheelchair user. So I can thank Tanny Gray Thompson for the beginning of my disability education around language.
But I think that says a lot that, a wheelchair user who was 13 or 14, who had always gone to schools full of other children with disabilities and support needs, was actually found herself in that position of using a word that a lot of other disabled people would go, "Well, actually, I'm not all right with this word." So, that fear, as much as I understand that fear coming from the non-disabled community, it's amongst everybody. We all put our foot in our mouth sometimes.
Me especially. I'm always doing it. Yeah, it's not an exclusive. It's not an exclusive thing that just able-bodied people do. Disabled people do it all the time. And it is a question of just asking that question, like, what is it I call you? Is not an offensive, what would you like to be called? We put that on our pre-recording forms, don't we? What is it you would like to be referred as? It's just a polite question. And it might sound direct and centuries ago, asking what would you like to be called would have been probably considered rude. And I think it's just breaking that barrier down and saying, look, what is it I call you?
Well, and it's really interesting. You look across the forms that we've got back, and the responses that we've got have come really across the board. We've had some people, for example, it's what do we call you? And it's people named Jessica has said Jess. Whereas there have been some people who've said, what do we call you? And they've said, I have cerebral palsy, so you can describe me as a wheelchair user or something like that. It's really interesting how people use, it's open to different interpretations to different people and I think that says a lot about that person's sort of understanding and approach to that question is, well, what do I call myself in a lot of ways?
It didn't even really cross my mind that you wanted to know anything other than like what name, because obviously people have like nicknames and things, so I just assumed Jessica, that's fine. But now you've kind of mentioned it, I know with Marfan Syndrome that quite a lot of people identify as Marfs.
Okay.
Which I think is I'm quite happy to identify as a Marf, and I have, you say kind of like Marf power, and you say I do, whenever I do anything on social media with it, I do kind of identify as that. But then there is a huge community of Marfan Syndrome people that they hate the word Marf. They think it belittles the condition and it singles them out as different and everything. So I think it really just depends on kind of your, like you were saying, like your view of who you are and what you identify as. And
I think a lot of that's influenced by your experiences as well. I think if you've had a lot of negative experiences with your health condition, i.e. you've been in and out of hospital, you perhaps haven't had all your needs met, you've been very poorly, then I can understand that you might be like, well, actually going around saying, oh, I'm just a Marf is not representative of actually some of the trials that you had to go through. I think it's very interesting because I know that, you know, you have had to go through some big medical sort of experiences, that you are happy to identify yourself with that sort of, I don't want to say flippant, you're happy to identify yourself with a casual term like that.
Yeah, I think now definitely more than ever, really, like definitely more than I used to. I've done a lot more kind of research into it, because I had like a basic knowledge of Marfan syndrome growing up. Like I wanted to kind of know why I was a bit different, and my mum would obviously tell me certain things, and there was a huge amount of medical jargon and stuff that I didn't understand at my appointments. So my mum would then obviously kind of spoon feed it to me a bit and explain what things meant and what was happening.
And this was all before the internet, when you couldn't just Google stuff. You were reliant on, you know, reading.
And...
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, like having the surgeries that I had, and with them being so kind of out of the blue for me, I mean, they were and they weren't. I was always told that aortic surgery was possibly on the cards for me, having the diagnosis of Marfan's, but they also said it would happen in the teenage years. And I managed to get to kind of uni and nothing had happened. There was no kind of issues other than like needing strong prescription glasses and painkillers now and again and stuff like that. I lived a relatively normal life, quote unquote normal, but so it could have been a lot worse. And then it happened to be November 2013. I went for my annual ECG heart scan at Glenfield Hospital, and I've been going there since I was a baby, pretty much. And they're brilliant. They see me every year, and it was nothing really out of the normal. Although I had been experiencing like slight chest pains, and I'm not telling the story very well. We should really start at the beginning. So a couple of weeks prior to this, I'd been sat at home and I felt absolutely fine, and all of a sudden everything got really tight around my sort of chest, lungs, heart area, that whole bit here. And I freaked out. I didn't know what was happening. And I've always had palpitations. I've always been told that they're nothing to worry about, but obviously if they happen regularly, to, you know, call 111. So I hadn't really had any palpitations or anything. It literally just felt like something had tightened around my windpipe, although I could still breathe okay, but everything just felt really close inside. That's how I'd describe it.
Close for
like
comfort.
Kind of like squeezing a balloon, I suppose, is how I'd describe it, or like stretching it. I don't know. But basically, we rang an ambulance. They decided to send out an ambulance to me, and they checked me over. And at the time, I wasn't as kind of educated, and I didn't really. Basically, I didn't say I have Marfan syndrome. It affects my heart and my aorta, so I think I should go to hospital and get a scan, because what we were worried about was I was having an aortic dissection, which is a huge part of Marfan syndrome. That's like the biggest worry, basically. I didn't mention any of that. They just said, well, we can't really find anything wrong with you. Your blood pressure's fine, your airways, your breathing. But if you do want to go to A&E, obviously go, but we can't take you, kind of thing. So me and my partner trundled off to A&E. They couldn't find what was wrong. They didn't do any scans or anything at the time, and I really cross at myself, and I know my mum's definitely cross at me. I didn't really get the kind of warning lights of, I have Marfan syndrome, I have a heart condition, this can like rupture, this can tear, blah blah blah, I need an ECG. So nothing of that was said, and I don't blame myself for it, but I really wish I'd known more than I do now, and I'd have just put two and two together, because it didn't feel like my heart. It wasn't like a heart issue
No.
in my brain.
Yeah.
It didn't feel
So
like
you think that happened because of a kind of a lack of your understanding? It wasn't sort of a denial thing. If you go, I don't want this to be my heart, I'm not going to bring it up.
No, because if I'd have actually said, like, I have this condition, please can I have a scan, it would have got caught much sooner. But I just didn't connect the dots.
Mm-hmm.
And the person I did see was in the ear, nose and throat department, and they continued to want to put a camera up and down, like up my nose and down. And they tried to do it a couple of times, and I freaked out, and I was like, look, you can't do this, basically. And they said what they thought it was, and without being able to put the camera down, was just swollen glands, and I just had something wrong with my glands or neck or something. So
airwaves.
Just go home. Yeah, just go home, and if it persists, come back. So
did you tell your mum about this at the time?
No, but that was because previous to this, like throughout kind of teenage years, I would wake up in the middle of the night with heart palpitations, and they'd last for about a few minutes, and then they'd die down, they'd go away, and then I'd fall asleep, and I'd mention it, and she'd say, well, if they happen regularly, then we'll take you for an appointment, but things like that will happen. Like, I have a unusual heartbeat anyway, a bit of arrhythmia, so I have like a extra beat every now and again anyway. So I just kind of got used to things being a bit strange inside, if that makes sense.
No, I understand. I get flashing lights, and sometimes they're really bad, and sometimes it's not really anything. But if I, my other half has asked me about it before, and if I told you every time I saw flashing lights, I'd be every 4 or 5 minutes going, oh, they're back, and they're gone, and they're back, and they're gone.
I was just going to say, very similar to that, like it was more regular for me to have something irregular happening than not. So I didn't tell her, and I had work the next day, and I went to work, and I feel like I'd just started a new job as well at the time. It was a dream job that I'd wanted for a long time, and it was quite a physical job, which anyone with any understanding of Marfan Syndrome, that's not really something that we can do. It's not really in our wheelhouse of difficult things to do. I mean, office and admin, and those are the kind of things that are in the books of Marfan Syndrome. These are the kind of employment opportunities you should like outsource and things like that and look for.
But that kind of sustained physical work is not. Yeah, it's not.
No.
Yeah.
So in a book I got quite recently, it basically said, don't try and be an Olympic athlete. Don't try and be a builder. Don't anything who works with heavy machinery, anything like that.
Bit of a party pooper, really, isn't it? To be fair.
Yeah. So, and it wasn't anything like that. It was just, I was a photographer for a family portrait studio, but the gear is heavy, and it's a lot of jumping around with children and being entertaining and all of that stuff. But I was absolutely brilliant at it for like a month, and then this happened to like my chest, and then I think I tried to do something and it just felt wrong, so I basically had some time off work, and I'd phoned the hospital and said, something's not right, can I be seen a bit sooner than my appointment in November? Everything feels a bit tight. And I don't know if they're just used to, the boy who cried wolf or anything, and they're just used to people being like, something's wrong, and then everything's absolutely fine. But they said, like, the soonest appointment we could get for you is only a couple of days before your appointment anyway. Like, they were very busy for my typical scans and stuff. So I just went along with it. I was just too polite, and what I really should have done at the time is said, no, something's wrong. I need to come in for an emergency scan. Something needs to be done because I'm worried. But I was just that kind of okay, then they don't seem to be too worried about it, so it's fine.
Yeah.
And at this point, my mum went to my appointments with me just because she likes to take in all the information and she's got quite a good head for that. And then I just kind of sit there and like answer any questions.
Yeah.
And that was kind of how my whole knowledge of my condition and stuff was my whole life. Like my mum was the one that spoke and understood everything, and I was just kind of, yeah, felt all right, or whatever they asked me.
I think that's partly a problem with the medical approach. What would have been far better would have been if you'd had somebody who could, from a young age, involve you in those appointments and help you understand from a young age. Because as much as, particularly when you're a child, it's important for your mum to know and be involved. But ultimately, it's your body, it's your life. It should be you who, you're the person who knows your body best. It should be you who understands your condition.
And I think that's more my fault in part, because my mum has kind of been amazing my whole life. I mean, she's been a single parent since I was 2, so she's kind of took on everything. But she was never really pushy, and she'd never like tell me to stop talking in the appointments. It's just, I think I chose to be a bit absent from it all, or just not necessarily to avoid anything or hide anything, but I just assumed I was fine, so mum will handle it.
I think as well, when you are a kid and you have to go to those big appointments, they are very scary, whether you've got your parents with you or not. They are extremely scary.
Well, and I also think that when you live in it every day, it's kind of a bit disinteresting after a while. You're like, oh, I've done this already.
Yeah,
completely.
So yeah, I stuck to my original appointment because I didn't want to make a fuss. And the day before that appointment, I thought it would be a brilliant idea to go to Alton Towers.
Oh no!
With a group of friends. And because as far as I was concerned, nothing was really wrong. I thought maybe it's like a viral kind of chest infection or a cold. I didn't know what was happening, and it didn't feel that painful. So I just thought, go to Alton Towers, enjoy the scare fest. So it wasn't even just normal. It was people jumping out at you and doing all, like, couldn't have been worse. I'm not proud of this, and I do not condone people with Marfan Syndrome to go on board.
We must insert a disclaimer here. Please do not try this at home.
No.
If you have a heart condition and you're experiencing chest pains, perhaps don't go to a theme park where people are going to try and terrify you.
Yes, just avoid it at all costs. I mean, somehow, luckily, I was fine and spent the whole day, and there's a lot of walking and excitement and anything. But yeah, and then went to the appointment at the hospital the next day. Met my mum there, and the ward is upstairs, like where it is. So it's like up 2 flights of stairs, and I physically remember walking the first flight of stairs, and my mum looking at me, and she could see my pulse coming out of my neck.
Oh,
like
Jesus!
Like quite bad.
I mean, that is serious.
Yeah, and she sort of said, like, how long has this been happening? And I was like, nearly 3 weeks.
That is going to be the ultimate mom telling off, that is, isn't it?
And they tell you if you've had a cold for more than 2 weeks that you should be worried. So if your heart's been beating out your fucking neck for 3 weeks,
you're beating out of your neck.
Yeah, and we went in. They saw me, and all I can remember is because it's the ECG and it's the echo as well. So they do, and I've had this since I was a baby every year, so I'm absolute pro at it. It's like the little sticky wires on you, and they do the readout of your heart, and then they do the one with the jelly and the ultrasound. So they do that, and I just remember the woman who's normally really chatty, who does my ultrasound, being really quiet, and I didn't know why, and I just thought, oh, maybe she's having a bad day. And she walked out of the room. I got dressed, got all the jelly off me and everything. And then I remember we went in to see the specialist, the cardiac specialist. and it was a new guy. It was a new man because my original guy had left or something, and it was literally his first day, which I found out later. And he basically told me that I had to stay in because my aorta had torn, which is something that is obviously very Marfan-y. Because the aortic root, with the amount of pressure and everything, it can dilate, and if it dilates to a certain amount, it will tear, and that's what I've been on medication for.
You went to Alton Towers.
Yes.
I mean, my God.
Yeah, I didn't know. And yeah, I mean, it is a joke every time. Luckily, it can be a joke because I am still here. But every time we even mention it or go to a hospital checkup or things now, because they still obviously happen, it is like, oh, and you know, she went to Alton Towers the day before, and I'm sat there like, sorry.
You're never going to live that down. I mean, sod Bear Grylls, to be fair. I mean, that is like...
Yeah. Yeah, and I just remember his name was Dr. McDonald, and he was very Scottish. And I just remember in his
Shout
accent...
out Dr. McDonald.
I just remember him saying, yeah, you can't go Christmas shopping with your mum. You need to stay here because your aorta has torn. We need to get you in for emergency surgery.
I mean, what a first day.
Yeah.
Fucking hell.
You're not going to forget that in a long time, are you, really, to be fair?
Yeah, he's probably at dinner parties going, and then there was this fucking lash who'd been to Alton Towers.
He's been dining out on that story for years.
And then I saved her life.
Yeah. And I just remember one of the lovely cardiac liaisons coming out with a wheelchair and him saying, come on. And he was so lovely. And he just said, come on then, let's get you in this chair and get you down to where they prep you.
Yeah.
And they obviously put all the stuff in you. And it didn't seem real. Like we were going down corridors and things, and I didn't feel like anything was happening.
No.
I remember sitting on the bed, getting like the pre-op kind of stuff happening to me. And my mum said, where's Rob? Like, Rob's my partner. And I said, he's at work. And she's like, I'm going to ring him because he probably needs to be here.
Yeah.
And at the time, he worked in retail. So unbeknownst to me, she'd rang him. He'd got in a taxi, got to the hospital. He came in. He had a little bit of time with me before I was taken off to surgery. And I'm trying to remember it because there's been a few surgeries. I think this one was the one that was 13 hours long.
Holy, I mean...
I think. It was definitely over 10 hours.
Do you think that because it happened so quickly, it was quite a good thing because it didn't give you any chance to dwell on anything?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't give me a chance to kind of run away. Yeah, I mean, I was stuck there and it was happening. It was terrifying though, because
it was, of course.
Like, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if I'd make it or anything like that. But then, that was just like, that was the beginning. Like, it was that surgery, and because it was such an emergency surgery and they weren't necessarily prepared for it, they did something that would fix it for a bit.
Right, so it was a bit like getting sellotape out on the phone when the phone falls apart, yeah.
But
yeah.
in the shape of, like, I think they use pig for want of a nicer word. It's like
they do. I've literally just read about this in a book. There is there's part of a pig and a cow that is ideal. It's a ligament that's ideal for use in basically tying around aortas.
Yeah. So that's what they did.
Alice is training to become a heart surgeon since I spoke to her this morning.
I happen to be reading I can also tell you, I have a lot of random biology facts out of my non-fiction book I've been reading. Did you know that giraffes are the only animals that are sometimes born with and sometimes born without a gallbladder? And they don't seem to have any idea why.
What am I going to do with this information, Alice? What?
Might come in useful at a pub quiz sometime, a really obscure pub quiz.
This is a new feature called Alice Tells Us.
Random shit Alice knows.
What were we talking about? I can't even remember what we're talking about. Oh,
Jessica's major heart surgery.
Yeah. Let's get back to that. Yeah, I mean, I am getting to the end. So they did the quick fix, and then they said you're going to need more surgery in a couple of years, but that needs to calm down. But what I didn't know is when they'd done that surgery, they then did an MRI scan just to make sure everything was looking good and everything was where it should be.
Yeah.
And they found, I didn't know, but they found something else wrong with me. I had an abdominal aneurysm. So, which is also kind of partly to do with Marfan's and also just a bit bad luck. But it basically described it as it looks like a water balloon, like part of your abdominal aorta. The bit it's kind of right at the bottom of your ribs, a bit lower than that actually. Had swollen and it was going to explode if they didn't do a procedure on it. And it, sorry if it's a bit graphic.
No, it's not. It's shocking. It's not graphic at all.
Within 2 weeks of the first surgery, I was then transported in the middle of the night to a different hospital here in Leicester.
Please tell me it was by helicopter.
No, it was an ambulance.
Man.
It was pretty cool to go in an ambulance, I must say. That's my first time.
Did you have the flashing lights and everything?
Did you have the knee knobs on?
No, because it was like 3 in the morning, so no. Which is a shame.
Yeah.
I also remember they drove down the road that my house is on, and I remember kind of looking and being like, oh, I miss my cat. But then, yeah, so I went to the second hospital, had a few days stay. They scheduled in the aneurysm operation, which was 10 times worse than the open heart surgery. So the open heart surgery, actually, I didn't really feel anything. I wasn't in particular pain. It was probably the amount of morphine I was on. And like,
I feel like we should make clear at this point, when you say you didn't feel anything, you mean afterwards. You weren't awake during either surgery.
No.
Do you know, thank you for clarifying that, Alice, because I actually thought she was lying awake. Like,
oh, fuck no.
No, I was
Open heart surgery, crack your fucking rib open like they're doing an autopsy.
Oh, Alice, I've got to have my tea later. Stop it.
But yeah, so after they'd sawn my rib cage open and then done the first 12, 13 hours, however long it was, and then they like pinned it back together, basically. I believe my rib cage is like part metal and it's like conjoined together. Anyway, and then, yeah, so I had the second surgery. So within 4 weeks, I'd had 2 massive open surgeries in my kind of torso. And that second one was much worse. And then I went to stay with my mum for a while and she was brilliant and my friends were brilliant and they'd come and see me and everything. But then in the back of my head, I knew that they'd said I need a second heart surgery at some point in a few years. And they basically said to me, in like 2 years' time, we'll do you again. It'll be planned, it'll be better, you know, we'll know exactly what we're doing. Not that they didn't, but, you know, there's just kind of that process involved of preparation as well. And I just remember them saying to me, don't do anything too, obviously don't go to Alton Towers. Don't do anything that's going to be too much of an exertion. So my job role had to change a little bit. I mean, obviously had quite a long time off work anyway, but I basically was just waiting for this next operation, and then that happened in April 2015, which was nearly 2 years, and then that one was the planned one, and that was the more interesting one because that's the one that I think has properly saved my life, prolonged my life as well. because they did a procedure and I got to choose what part I got, so I could still go for the kind of natural kind of fleshy pig heart pieces,
Yes.
or I could go for mechanical. And they explained to me very clearly, if I got a mechanical heart valve, I wouldn't be able to have children, which is a whole other topic that we can talk about after I finish this very long story. And I decided that the mechanical heart valve was the option for me, because they said the likelihood of you needing any more surgery is a lot less with this. This will basically outlive you. So.
And how old were you at this point?
This was 2015, so I was, how old am I now? Like 28? I was 28, I think. I'm 32 now, so maths is not a strong point of mine. So yeah, 5 years ago. Is that right? Yeah.
You were going to be 27.
Yes, thank you.
There you go.
Yeah, and then I had to sign. I remember signing things, so the hospital obviously didn't get in any trouble if I didn't make it.
Oh, jeez.
Which I didn't have time to do in the first operation, so that was all.
I mean, that in itself, I mean, to be told that if you have this sort of mechanical heart and you can't have children is one thing, and then say, oh, sign this just in case anything happens.
Yeah.
Just in case you die, we don't want your mum to sue us.
We're going to kick you. We're going to kick you a bit and then kick you a bit more, just to make sure you are down and out. But
thoroughly kicked.
That's an incredible. I mean, I don't want children, and I made a decision very early on that I didn't want children, and I think part of that decision is because I am in a wheelchair, and I would find it very difficult. I find it very difficult to look after myself. Never mind another child. But to have that decision, it's either this. We could do it like this, and you could have children, or you could do it like this and not have children. That is a huge decision to make at such an early age as well. I mean, just around the time when you may possibly be thinking about families.
So it was and it wasn't, and we can come back round to that in a minute. But it definitely was. It was interesting having the power to choose, because my mum, and she wanted me to have the natural kind of cow bit. I'm sure there's a proper word for it. I can't remember what it is. So I apologise for saying, bovine. Yeah, I apologise for saying pigs and cows.
But call it what it is.
Yeah. So she wanted me to have that, just so I had the option. But all I could think was, I don't want to go through this again.
No,
I possibly will have to anyway. But if it can be kind of less likely, I'm going to choose that option. And that operation went really well, and that one was, I think, 8 hours or something. But then the interesting thing about that one, and we are very near the end of my operation bit, the interesting thing, I remember them, because I was hooked up to a machine that was making my heart beat for me in the ICU, and I remember them coming in, the big team of doctors all stood around the bottom of my bed, and they wanted to see if my heart would beat for itself. And I remember them turning the dial down off to see if my heart would kickstart.
Yeah.
And I was sat up, and I remember just literally, they turned it, and I literally flopped downwards. I could feel all the life coming out of me, and just literally going down. And then they were like, no, quick, turn it back on, put it back on. And they literally turned me back on.
Turn it back on?
Yeah.
Like those lights on a dimmer switch. You turn it down, you turn it down, and it goes off. And you go, oh, no, turn it back on again.
It was exactly like that. And my mum was there for that bit, and she was just, she was a state. I'd
be fucking hysterical. I'd just be screaming.
And it was literally like a few seconds. It wasn't like they left me there for ages. But they tried it a number of times to see if my heart would start, because I was in ICU for probably a week, and they normally like to get you on the ward within a couple of days, because obviously ICU beds are quite important for people that are dying or surviving. And they came to me again and they said, your heart isn't starting by itself. So what we're going to elect to do, obviously with your permission, is install a pacemaker. So I am a 32-year-old with a pacemaker and a mechanical heart valve. So I think that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And then the pacemaker implementation was 10 times more painful than anything I'd had done before. It might have just been that I was hysterical from like everything I'd been through. It might also be because I couldn't lie on my back because of the way they'd had to open my ribs. I was meant to be supported.
Yes.
Sorry.
We need to put a trigger warning at the beginning of this episode,
Yeah,
or just like this episode may contain scenes that some listeners will find upsetting.
That's if we can record it, because I've not fainted on the floor.
Yeah, this is the end of our podcast because Lucy is dead now.
And then the very last like gross thing is that for pacemakers, you're awake while they're doing it.
How do they do it?
So they numb. Normally it's done on your left where your heart obviously is.
Yeah.
They couldn't do it on that side for me because I'd had a blood clot, a really bad intravenous blood clot in my left arm, which had made it swell like a balloon from the first surgery. And they tell me that happened because my arm was caught underneath me for some of the operation. You know, I mean, there was one point in those kind of 2 years where I couldn't lift my arm up to like brush my hair because my left arm was so bad. So they couldn't do the pacemaker on that side. So they ended up doing it on my right. And all I can remember is they obviously gave me gas and air. They injected me with like a numbing something. And then it just feels like a lot of pushing. That's all I can explain. But the pain wasn't from the actual thing going in. It was from my back. And then also he had to put more injections in me because for some reason it didn't numb properly. And all I can remember is, you know, those blue sheets that they put on to do surgery. And obviously they've got the bit open and that's the bit they work on. And everything else has got like just a blue bit around it.
And there's a bit up so you can't see like what's going on.
Yeah. So to get the bit showing on my shoulder, the blue thing had to go over my face.
Oh no.
So I just had like this medical, I don't know what it is, fabric just over my face, as well as a mask giving me gas and air and trying to calm me down, as well as just a surgeon like pushing and it was violent. Like it felt like he was punching me, and I'm sure he was doing a very good job and was brilliant, but at the time I was like, please stop.
That does actually sound like some sort of like torture technique that they use to get information out of people. That is
it definitely
horrendous.
felt like that.
Yeah.
And it's basically about the size of two £2 coins on top of each other, is attached to part of me on the inside, and then it's got little wires that go, and obviously it's a pacemaker, so I'm sure you probably know what they do, but the wires keep your heart going. So that's over, and then they take me up to the ward. The next day my heart starts beating by itself, so I now have a pacemaker for no reason whatsoever.
Just an accessory. It's an accessory.
Yeah. With a battery life of 10 years, and it works. Because obviously you have to get that. I have a checkup for that every year now as well.
Yeah.
And they put something on you to make sure it's working, and they can turn you on and off and stuff like that. And they worked out that since I've had it, it's been used 0.01% of the time. Whereas normal people are like 90% of the time. So
I mean,
yeah.
So it is doing something, but just not very often.
I think it's mostly when I sleep, if at all. But yeah, and they can tell me when it's kicked in. There's also when I have to have MRI scans or CT scans, which I have every year, they have to turn it on for that, because your heart needs to be pacing, and I'm not entirely sure why, but that might be the 0.01% of when it gets used.
So it's actually, you've never needed it. It's been turned on by professionals, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
So you've just told us, you just spent 20 minutes telling us about all this. No. All these surgeries and hugely invasive and physically and I think mentally traumatic and life-changing and life-saving, and yet things that directly link to your health condition, and yet you don't feel as though you have a disability. I just want to kind of draw the parallels there of going, I mean, your health condition disabled you so much that your life was in danger, seriously.
They had to turn the dial back up.
Yeah. And again, I just not necessarily asking you and calling on you to change the way that you feel and identify about this web, but it's something, to bring people's focus to that, to say, well, actually, if disability is a negative word, this is somebody who's, I mean, your story's a bit insane.
To be honest, I think I'm a little tiny bit traumatized, if I'm honest.
Sorry.
It's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I see like where you're coming from, but to me it just feels normal. That's what happens to people with Marfan syndrome. So I've just kind of taken it on. But I mean, I would never be ashamed to say I have a disability. Never. I just don't feel like I'm disabled enough to have a disability, I suppose, is how I'd look at it. But then that's just kind of my understanding of it, I guess. But no, I could definitely see where you're coming from.
I think it would be really interesting if we've got anybody out there with Marfans who is listening to sort of hear what their feelings are and responses are to those kind of labels.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I mean, I would definitely be sharing this podcast with like on the forums and stuff, and it's just my point of view, I have to say as well. Like, someone else could be suffering of all sorts of different things, or Marfan traits are different in so many people, which I've already said. The same as, if we're going to talk about children in a second, there are people that have had children with Marfan syndrome. That was never a path for me at all. From a very young age, I kind of knew that I shouldn't. I don't know what came first. It's kind of like the chicken or the egg. I don't know if I was told that I shouldn't have children, ideally, or if I decided that I didn't want children. But from pretty much
Can you qualify that shouldn't? Who and why were you being told that? Just for our listeners out there.
Yeah, of course. So my GP and cardiac specialists at the hospital mostly. So it's well known that Marfan syndrome is a hereditary condition. It can also be, it can just kind of appear like an abnormal gene. As like
the same with mine.
Yeah. So I think mine is a mutated gene. Now, I don't have any confirmation of this, but this kind of goes back to that genetic testing that we were talking about earlier. My mum got tested and she didn't have any of the traits. I mean, she's slightly tall for a lady, but nothing else particularly stands out with my mum that she would have Marfan's. Now, I don't know my dad, which is a whole other topic, but from the 2 pictures I've seen of him, 2 photographs, he's quite tall and slim. But again, I remember my mum trying to reach out to him and saying, Jess has this condition, you can get a test for it if you want to. And I'm pretty sure he said no and he wasn't interested. And then my granddad, I mean, potentially, but it was never diagnosed, but he was very tall. But the only reason I say my granddad is because I know it can also skip a generation.
Right.
So if if he did have it undiagnosed, but then he did live a very long life. So undiagnosed and without like medication and things, obviously he's not around any longer, unfortunately, but without obviously speaking to him about it, I would never know. But no. I don't believe so personally. So I think it was a kind of just abnormality, like mutant gene for me. However, if someone with Marfan syndrome was to have children, there's a 50% chance that their child would then have it as well. And it's whether it's a boy or a girl, it's exactly the same outcome, 50% likely that they'd have it.
Right.
Obviously, you could argue that it's 50% they might not have it. And if that was the case, then maybe it potentially would be different. But for me personally, and I have done a lot of research and reading on it growing up, if I was to obviously I can't because of the operation, which we spoke about earlier, but if I was to have a child, the strain on my heart and my aorta and everything, I might not make it through the pregnancy. And it's all might nots and maybes, and there's no right answer as such. But yeah, so I might not, I'd struggle through the pregnancy, definitely. I might not make it. There might be, I think the books phrase it as fatal pregnancy kind of periods and things. And then giving birth, there would be no chance of a quote unquote normal pregnancy. It would be a cesarean or anything like that. So there are options, and I'm not saying that people with Marfan syndrome don't have children and shouldn't have children. Obviously, it's a huge debate on all sorts of levels, but it's personal to the person. Now, I decided from a very young age that I didn't want if I had a child, I didn't want them to go through what I'd been through, because it's been pretty tough, to be honest, with everything considered. And I'm also just not very maternal. Like, I don't not like children, but I've just always not really been that kind of, oh, look at the baby. So
I think as well, if you take the whole disability health condition angle out of it, motherhood isn't necessarily for every woman. And I know that society's like, oh, you know, when are you going to have kids? And that is a common question that near enough every woman has to answer at some point. But it's not for every woman. And I think as well that even if I was able-bodied, probably kids wouldn't be something I would be massively interested in. However, it does stop people asking me, oh, so when are you going to settle down and have children? I don't normally get that question asked very often, and I don't know whether that's because I'm disabled or whether I just give off a vibe that's like, I don't want kids. Give me a gin instead.
It's you going down the street and pushing all of those children you see and hitting them with sticks. That's what it is, Liz.
Who's told you about that? But so it does sort of stop the intrusive question of, so when are you having children? When have you met Mr. Right? I don't tend to get those questions. They've never played with me like other people. But it's not a question that, it's not something that is for every woman, really.
No, and I do get those questions. Like recently at work, someone like said, so I talk about my partner quite often, and we've been together nearly 13 years, and it was like, oh, you getting married then, or when's babies happening and things. And my brother, he's older than me by 3 years, and he's got 2 little ones, and he's a brilliant dad and all of that stuff. So I do get interaction with kids, and I love my niece and nephew dearly, and part of me does wish that I could give my mum grandchildren, just because there's something very different about my brother being the dad and obviously his lovely wife being the mum. Her mum is kind of
the main grandma.
Not more important, obviously, but exactly, the main grandma. Whereas if I had children, my mum would have much more of like a say, and that, and we've had conversations about that as well. And I think that's part of the reason why she wanted me to have the bovine bits. But because I chose the mechanical valve, the reason that decision was then taken away from me, and it is simply because the mechanical valve requires me to take warfarin for the rest of my life, which are blood thinners.
Right.
During pregnancy, you can't be on warfarin. So that's the plain and simple, that's why I can't and won't have children. And obviously then there are all the other options available, like adoption or surrogacy, or which are all brilliant options as well. And I think definitely for certain people, that's perfect for them. For me, it's just not.
I mean, it sounds like kids were not really, like Lucy, it's just not something that is particularly for you. How did, was that something that you discussed with your partner before making the decision about the valve? How did you find people, particularly being 26, 27, that experience of saying to people, actually, I've decided, and I know that means I can't have children, but this is, was that something that you found difficult, that people found difficult to understand?
Well, with regards to my partner, I mean, when we first got together, obviously it was early days and children wasn't really mentioned for a while. And then I did tell him about Marfan Syndrome quite early, and I explained everything about how it can affect children and stuff, and they probably weren't for me. But then a lot of people's answers to things like that is, oh yeah, but you might grow out of it, you might change your mind when you're older, and they're obviously valid opinions as well. But then I'm quite lucky with my partner because he also doesn't want children. Now, part of me wonders if that's because I can't have children now, or didn't want children and wouldn't have children. Maybe he's kind of not gone along with it. Yeah, I mean, he's adamant to me that he didn't want to have children. He still doesn't want to have children. It's not something in his future, and he gets a lot of enjoyment out of the niece and nephew and family and all of that stuff. But for us to have children, that's not on the table at all.
Well, and I think that it's perfectly legitimate choice to say, actually, I'm happy to not have children if it means that I get to be with this person. Because if children were more important to you than being with that person, then you wouldn't have stayed with that person.
Exactly.
Yeah, and hopefully that's how he feels. But then I do remember that I don't think he was there when I was choosing what valve to have.
Was it just put on the spot in the moment sort of thing? They said this one or this one, decide?
I think they did give me about an hour, but
wow.
He was at work. He visited me every day. Bless him, he was brilliant, but he was at work and my mum was with me at the time.
Yeah.
And actually, I don't think it crossed my mind to even ask him, because I knew that we'd both said not children and we weren't interested. And at that point, we'd been together 5, 6 years, something like that. We'd been together a number of years anyway. And yeah, it just, I feel a bit guilty now that I didn't ask him. But, yeah.
I think it's pretty poor practice on the part of the hospital. I know they saved your life and everything, but there's what if you hadn't been certain and they're like, you've got an hour to decide? You really feel as though, particularly if this was for the second planned operation, they should have gone, oh, just an FYI, 3 weeks before we saw you open again.
Yeah.
Have a think about this.
Yeah, not an hour beforehand, cue the countdown music and off I go and I'll see you in an hour.
Yeah.
I mean, it might have been a little over an hour, but I just remember being so headstrong that as soon as they said the words, you're less likely to need more.
Well, I suppose, yeah.
Surgery. And because I was already in quite a happy place of children just aren't for me, that's not something that's going to be in my future, then I think that made it easier to just make that decision. But yeah, it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like for you the decision was about you, and actually you'd already decided about children, so that was kind of neither here nor there.
Yeah, I think so.
Jess, we like to use our podcast as a platform for our guests. So one of the questions on your pre-recording form was if you had the opportunity to sort of give a message to any listeners who may be listening and are learning about health conditions and disabilities, what would it be? So what would your message to people who are trying to understand differences a bit more and things like that, what would your message be to our listeners?
Just to start conversations a bit more, and not be kind of afraid to talk about quite serious subjects, because I think, if anything, I mean, particularly looking at like the three of us, for example, we're quite easy to speak to, and we can make kind of joke about things, and it just is about kind of, there's an element of obviously getting on with things and dealing with what you're dealt and that sort of stuff. But then I believe that the more that people kind of understand and can kind of venture into those unknown waters of like, right, well, I'd love to know more about this, or what does this mean for these kind of people, and how does this impact their lives, and what can I do to have a better knowledge, and then also not necessarily help in any way, because I wouldn't necessarily say that, but the main thing I would say is to just acknowledge difference and just communication, and just ask all the questions you can, and just, yeah, probably that.
That's brilliant. I think that's rounded everything up.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, I
rounded
think that's a really nice end.
Nicely. So thank you so much for joining us, Jess. I hope we've not traumatised you or asked you too many difficult questions.
No, not at all.
I think if anybody's traumatised Lucy, I think it's you.
I think I'm going to have a lie down with a cold drink or something. No, it's been really fascinating to hear your story, Jess. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing with us, Jess.
Hey, you're very welcome. It was very enjoyable, and I hope I didn't put you off your dinner or anything.
Is there any like social medias or anything you want to promote? Any charities that mean a lot to you? Anything you want to kind of just stick on the end for, go and do this, go and follow this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the British Heart Foundation has been a huge part of my life. And then also specifically the Marfan Trust. They're quite a smaller charity, but they obviously specialise in people with Marfan Syndrome. There's a lot of information if you headed onto the Marfan Trust website, which I believe is just marfantrust.org. Yeah, and just Marfan's is quite unknown, so just go and have a little look and see, and if anything's interesting, just enjoy reading about it, because one of the most important things about Marfan syndrome is quite a lot of people go undiagnosed, and they're just a bit tall or anything, and they just don't get the diagnosis that they need. About 200 people are diagnosed with it every year. So
wow, okay. Well, we'll be sure to put that out on all of our social medias and stuff as well. Cool. All right,
we'll put a link on our website, as Philip Schofield would say.
Thanks for listening to the lABLEd podcast. If you like the show, please rate, review and subscribe. You can follow us on social media at lABLEd podcast.
Thanks go to our editor Adam Hall, our music composer Maisie Crunden, and our graphic designer Sarah Coley.
We'll see you next time.